So yeah, I'm back again here with another unscripted video. Obviously, if you've already seen the title, you already know what it's about. But I just thought I would. These things I kind of like doing the last one. So yeah, I'm back here to talk about Jak and Daxter today. Is the sort of thing that I'm focusing on, and this kind of kicked off from an article. It was a Push Square article I saw, but they mentioned inside of it that it was picked up by VGC, and it was based on an episode of the Game Maker's Notebook. And this is Game Maker's Toolkit. That's a separate thing. Game Maker's Notebook series, which Ted Price, who's I think he's the I don't know if he's CEO. I can actually quickly check if things work quickly. I think founder and CEO of Insomniac Games. Yeah, okay. So there you go. Yeah, that's Ted Price, and he basically, I think he runs this and talks to different developers, and in this particular episode, he talks to Evan Wells, who is I think, co-president of Naughty Dog, and I actually need to go and listen to this myself, so I might have more thoughts to share on this later. I probably should have. I was actually considering listening to it first, and then I've started recording now, and this is where we're at. So if I butcher anything, got anything wrong, just understand that I haven't actually listened to the thing. But that's kind of what we'll discuss as part of this. Ted brings up to Evan about Jak and Daxter and about the idea of what if they did another game. Have they ever thought about it? I think. And Evan talks about the fact that they've had a couple of Twitter campaigns where people have tweeted them every day. The quote says, "We've had a couple of Twitter campaigns where people have been tweeting us every single day saying, 'I want a new Jak and Daxter, I want a new Jak and Daxter,' and they aren't just simple 280 character tweets. They have Photoshop memes and everything they're including on a daily basis, and the effort has got to be significant." And so, obviously, and I'm sure Naughty Dog already knew this, people want a new Jak and Daxter. But he kind of later goes on to mention that, obviously he says that, he hates to break it to them, but we don't have a Jak and Daxter in development right now. But then, I think as a continuation from that, he says, "But we still have the characters, and I see what you guys are Insomniac are doing with Ratchet, and that makes me wish that we did, and we would have one in development, because there's still a lot of love for Jak and Daxter in the studio." And so, I was talking about this with someone on Twitter, but we was kind of discussing so when I saw this, I was like, "Oh, this is awesome." Not that it's confirmed a new game, obviously. That it probably won't happen. I don't think it will. But I think it's cool to hear that there's obviously a lot of care, and they obviously love Jak and Daxter still, and it's something they still think about. But the kind of question we were debating was is Evan, because there's multiple ways you can interpret this, right? And especially if you've not heard the original context it was said in. But is he, I was kind of taking it as he was saying "Oh, I wish we did," "Oh, it would be cool to work on one," but that comes across as, "Oh, it's Sony aren't letting them." But then you can hear it a different way, where it's more he's saying, "Oh, he wishes they had one in development for those fans that want one," and obviously ideally, yeah, they would have one in development. So there's different ways you can look at this, but I found it an interesting interesting discussion, and it's cool to. It's always cool, I think, to see these old games like Jak and Daxter, especially series that I've grown up with. I mentioned in the last video that Ratchet and Clank comes out in a couple of months, so that's really cool for me as a fan of the old games. And similarly, seeing Jak and Daxter pop in the news is pretty cool, because, there hasn't been a Jak and Daxter game in, I think, I found it was 12 years, which is The Lost Frontier on PSP. But beforehand, the last game was Jak X, which I think was something 2005, maybe 2006, but it was a while back now, and obviously true Jak game was Jak 3 a few years before that. But yeah, I thought I would take this opportunity in the video to just sort of talk about what I would like from a new Jak and Daxter, and then, were Naughty Dog to return to it, which I don't think will happen, but I'm not going to rule it out, because it's sort of the point that I brought up in my last video about Sony's first-party lineup, is that there's not, tons of variety, and obviously that's done for a business move. A lot of the games that they're creating and developing and promoting and publishing and whatever else, a lot of them are similar. They've got obviously their own themes and everything, and you can listen to my full thoughts in that other video, which is very rambly as well. But yeah, they've obviously kind of a shifted focus, but it was Naughty Dog that kind of took on this kind of cinematic, set piece kind of style game, and I would imagine it was Uncharted that kind of kicked that off, and it was The Last of Us that really propelled that kind of game to the forefront, and that's kind of what led Sony's decision to, we need to focus heavily on single player and very and not that they won't invest into other things, but they obviously have a focus within their studio, and so I kind of think that as they continue to make games going forward, eventually I think there's going to have to be a shake-up of some kind, and it could be whatever form that could take, around whatever form. But I was thinking, I don't know if I actually said it in the video, but I was thinking that if anyone's going to do that, I think it'd be Naughty Dog. I feel like Naughty Dog are the kind of dev that, considering they are, I would imagine Sony aren't really going to say to them, no, we want this kind of game. I think Naughty Dog, out of all the devs, are probably the one that they're like, just, you do your thing because your games make us tons of money, so, and so yeah, I was kind of thinking that there's a chance that they might go back to those. But yeah, to get to kind of like my points about what I would want from a Jak and Daxter, they were actually Naughty Dog in the Last of Us, the making of Last of Us video called Grounded. They were talking in that about making a new Jak and Daxter. I think that they said that they were like in concepts and making conceptualizing stuff for several months before kind of coming up with Last of Us. But the kind of concept art they went for was this kind of, now of course we didn't see the game, so it was concept, it could have gone in any direction, but considering it was like Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley leading that project that then made The Last of Us, I wouldn't be surprised if it did go down the direction. But everything looked kind of dark and sort of gritty, and it looked like almost like a new take on Jak and Daxter, and from what I remember, they completely changed the way that Jak looked, and I think I say with Daxter as well, they kind of, and it was kind of weird to see, because I was like, well, hang on a minute, you're changing these characters, these characters that we know. And so yeah, if they were to make another one, I kind of, I'm not gonna say, oh, don't do this, don't do that, because at the end of the day, until I've seen it, I guess it's gonna be difficult to kind of judge. But I would hope that they wouldn't try and make it this, completely different game. I don't think it needs a reboot or reimagining it. I think, obviously if they're bringing, because it would be cool to say, oh, they're bringing back Jak and Daxter, but it's like, well, it depends, right? Are they continuing on? Are they doing another game in the world? Are they continuing with those characters? I think that a big part of what made those older games so great was just Jak and Daxter as characters, and the world they were in, and the characters they encountered, and the kind of, and the world was very, it was actually in TheGamingBritShow's, who's another YouTuber, does some analysis videos and reviews and whatever. You should heavily check him out. He's got some really good videos. But he mentioned something that obviously, because when I played these games, I was pretty young, and I obviously didn't really think much about the games. I was like, oh, it's just cool, in this cool world and cool characters, and I have obviously a lot of nostalgia from it all because of that. But he mentions that, or talks about how people don't tend to think as fondly, or at least generally people don't think as fondly, or don't remember much from those older games. And he thinks it was partly because of the fact that they are kind of, they're not really grounded in one sort of theme. Like Jak and Daxter's kind of futuristic, but it's also kind of you've got this high-tech technology in this kind of very futuristic city that's kind of run down. And you got a wasteland area, which is all desert, and then you've got, but through that wasteland area and then some of the hidden areas within the game and story related things, you get the precursor areas, which are clearly inspired by some of the Jak 1, or sort of, stemming from the Jak 1 style of some of the kind of temples and things like that. And it doesn't really, to me, I like that, but he thinks that kind of to try and almost for the mainstream, I guess, to sort of fully grasp onto that, I think, or at least my interpretation of what he was saying, is that people don't tend to latch onto that as well. Whereas if you play Uncharted, you kind of be like, oh, Uncharted's kind of realistic, really, in its setting, and, Last of Us is kind of realistic in its setting, and a lot of these games have worlds that are very coherent and all connecting, and I think from memory, Jak and Daxter was like that. At least, obviously, I actually replayed Jak 1 last year, and I think I replayed it the year before, but I haven't properly replayed Jak 2 or 3, or even X for that matter. So that's something that's kind of something I want to do at some point soon, because it's actually I was meant to do it last year. My plan was to do that, and I actually started this year with Ratchet and Clank. I was like, oh, I was going to play through Ratchet and Clank. So I played through one several times so I could grind out some bolts for the platinum trophy, and then Ratchet 2 I started, and I think I must be like near the end of this point. But my plan was to replay. But that's Ratchet. But I was meant to replay Jak and sort of check these games out and see what they were. See what they were kind of see what I think now. Going back to them. But yeah, getting back to the kind of the point I was making, I think that if they were to continue it, so actually another point, I've got some notes here by the way, so I'm kind of like looking over at the notes I've written, as key points to point out, so that I don't ramble too much, which I probably already have. We're like nearly 11 minutes already. Though to be fair, I say about this, but I actually kind of like the podcast like nature of these. I find that podcasts are probably more enjoyable when it's not like super focused on the topic kind of thing, because I feel like it makes it more interesting for the viewer to listen to. At least from my experience anyway. I prefer more hearing people that, I guess if you care about my opinions, but if people do care, I would imagine that maybe people would be interested, would just like kind of, if you're listening to this, you probably either care about my opinion or know me and just want to hear what I've got to say. And so me rambling on about other stuff maybe doesn't bother you too much. I don't know. Let me know if it's something that bothers you, but it'd be difficult for me to change it. But anyway, back to my point. If Naughty Dog were to continue Jak and Daxter, I obviously I think it would hopefully continue on from Jak 3, but I hope it would stay similar, but it would also kind of like be a good. Obviously, it's got to be a good jumping off point for newcomers, right? Because they can't make this game. They can't make a new Jak and Daxter and be like, oh, we're just carrying on like the story never stopped kind of thing, because a bunch of people haven't played those games, and they haven't remastered them. They've just ported them, and I think because of that, there's less chance people will check them out. I think even if they remastered them, people probably wouldn't check them out. But I do think that Naughty Dog would be the right developer to kind of do this first, to kind of, not necessarily to pivot the direction or anything, that could be a much like I assume it was with Uncharted and The Last of Us, and the kind of Sony's shifts to the kind of games they make. I would imagine it could be the catalyst if other devs did that, but, it would have to be a good jumping off point, good starting point for new players, but also, sort of to continue it on. And I think something that I thought when I was writing these notes is that Uncharted 4, I feel like, was a good example of sort of what I mean, just probably a little bit more connected to that. Because to me, like, you could play any Uncharted game, and you don't really need to play any of the other games. You could play them in any order you wanted to. But Uncharted 4 particularly you could play it on your own. You could play it on its own, sorry, and it would be fine, and you would probably have a great time with it. But you wouldn't have the same like connection and meaning behind a lot of its elements with the characters, but also things you can find in the world. If you played the game, you know in Uncharted 4 when you're at the beginning, you are in Nate's like attic or whatever. And is that what it's called? Is it called an attic in America? I'm sure there's another word for it in America actually. It might just be me. For some reason, I was thinking attic doesn't sound right. We call it attics. I think it's an attic, or I have no idea what I'm talking about. That's possible. But yeah, you're up there, and he's got all these artifacts from the previous games, and obviously, when I remember playing that at the time, and I was like, this is so cool. This is awesome. Like, as a fan, I'm seeing all these things that I've found in these previous games. And throughout the game, they have these like kind of little references and jokes and things that like Nate might say to Sully, or Sully might say, or these references. And I just find that Uncharted 4 has this like really, like, that you can tell Naughty Dog put like so much time and effort and care into that game. It's honestly it's unbelievable. And there's several other games. I think Devil May Cry 5 is probably, maybe even DMC 5 would be like almost a good. I don't think DMC 5 is the right comparison to make for a new Jak game, but in terms of the time between the last game and this, I mean, it's more for Jak than it was for DMC. But I think DMC sort of does a decent job-ish, though I do. At the same time, there's also a lot of things. I know it probably doesn't do the greatest job of being the easiest to get into. I don't know, but you know, I still think that I think Uncharted 4 was the right thing, best comparison for this. Um, but yeah, Naughty Dog put like so much care and effort into Uncharted 4, and I think that could carry across to Jak and Daxter. I think that, you know, it's going to have to be a new start. It's going to have to be a point where newcomers are going to come in and have, you know, be able to understand what's going on. But I also think it's got to somehow continue on, or it's got to somehow relate back to things, you know, for fans. And to be honest, that element I wouldn't have any. I don't think Naughty Dog are the kind to, you know, completely ditch all of the ideas and things that they did in the past, because I just sort of think that I get the feeling that Naughty Dog just really understand fans, and or at least they really understand how to, you know, put like really like craft something in a meaningful and careful way without being like, nah, screw what we did sort of thing. You know, we're starting anew, which I think you sort of see with other games. I'm going to mention God of War again. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I don't think they say screw what we did because they continue the story. But that's more of a gameplay thing. Again, this isn't the God of War podcast. This is going to be every single episode. It should make it a trend. How many videos can Josh? How many times can Josh not mention God of War? That's the running joke at the moment. But yeah. So I think Naughty Dog just have this like they're very attentive, and they get what fans probably want, and they get how to kind of make something meaningful. And as I said, Uncharted 4, as I've said many times before, I just think Uncharted 4 is such a great game, and it really meant a lot when I was playing it for the first time. And even I was actually watching some of my playthroughs that you can actually check on my YouTube channel that I did for Uncharted Week, and I just kind of got stuck watching the ending that I had kind of played through again, and I was mainly doing it because I was just updating some old things to kind of, you know, make all what I did about Uncharted Week and connect things to my website, just so that it's not completely random. People are like, oh, you just got this random playthrough. What's Uncharted Week? You know, so I made some adjustments there. But in doing that, I sort of was just watching the ending of Uncharted 4, and I didn't watch all of it, but I just find that fight with Rafe, and there's so many cool things about Uncharted 4. But I think that aspect, I really don't have any worries for Naughty Dog to sort of to do right. When it comes to the actual games and the gameplay, when I talk about like keeping it the same, you know, I think the kind of the humor, the world, the characters, the sort of. So I mentioned here about, you know, open world with segmented levels off to the side, which was kind of like that was how Jak 2 and 3 were. But I was actually thinking that if they did bring back Jak, I'm interested to know whether they would go for the same approach they did for Jak 2 and 3, or if they would decide that they were going to go, because of like how well the Insane Trilogy did for the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy. I actually wonder if they would potentially try and go for something like that instead. And I say just like the Insane Trilogy, but there's also Crash 4, and so potentially, you know, a Jak 1 style game might do better than Jak 2, 3, or X. I mean, certainly X. I think X was obviously a bit of a spin-off, which, by the way, is still really good, and the soundtrack of that game is fire. That's what people say, right? It's fire. It's so good. You should play Jak X, but I guarantee you, if you like racing games or anything arcadey like that, you're gonna love the game. And the soundtrack is just it's perfect. It's one of the greatest soundtracks I think I've heard. In fact, I think all the games have good soundtracks. Jak 1 has some really memorable pieces of music as well. But yeah, so I don't really know what I would want in terms of open world. I think for me, when it comes to like how the game plays and the open world and any aspect like that, I just kind of want a Jak game. And so for me, it's kind of like hopefully Naughty Dog will just do whatever they think works, kind of thing. You know, if they want to do a Jak 1 style game, then they'll do that. If they want to do a Jak 2 or 3 style, then they'll do it. Or if they want to make a spin-off racing game again, then yeah, I guess they'll do that. I hope they don't do that. I mean, I wouldn't complain, it's Jak, but I just don't think that's the right thing to do. So yeah, and obviously in terms of like the humor, I think it needs to come back. Like, there's a lot of cool jokes that they make in the old game, and you know, maybe some jokes don't hold up as well. Maybe there's conversations to be had about certain elements. I don't really I don't really know. I guess I don't really remember much of Jak 2 or 3. Jak 1 I mostly remember because I played it last year. But they just had like a bunch of goofy characters in it, and it was very cartoony and comical. But there's a chance that that's why they try to take it in more of a dark and gritty, like kind of serious direction before making Last of Us, because maybe they were like, oh, people can't relate to those characters because they're goofy cartoon characters, which, if I'm honest, I find sort of. I don't know if they would say people don't relate to them, but I'm like, man, it's a game, right? It is a games historically have been, when you look at all the games, are in fantasy worlds, or they contain just goofy things, and it is not real. The whole game, it is you're playing something that's not real, and I don't really think it's a problem to have cartoony characters. But as I said, a lot of this is, I can say what I'd like, but it depends. Naughty Dog might do something that I didn't think I'd want, but I actually still enjoy it. But yeah, then obviously in terms of gameplay, I think Jak's got like, I remember. So one thing I do remember about the Jak games, particularly in, I think Jak 2 and 3. But I think 3 was, well, I want to say I struggled less with 3, but Jak 2 especially. I remember comparing it to Ratchet and Clank, and the thing that they did between Ratchet 1 and 2 was they added a strafe to the combat, and the game became much more combat focused and combat heavy as a result, and it became more like a third person shooter sort of thing rather than the platforming sort of elements of 1. And they also had like upgradable weapons. There was a lot of things that did in Ratchet 2, but they added the strafe, so it was easier in combat to actually play. And I always remember thinking back to when I was younger, like, oh, this was like an element that, I wish Jak had, because Jak has combat with weapons and things, and it sometimes feels a bit like you just have to point and look in a direction and shoot, and it feels a bit, it just does it. I don't remember it feeling the easiest to play, but of course, that was years ago. I might go back to it, and I might be fine with it. It might be one of those things because I know people with Resident Evil 4, for example, Resi 4 has the bit where you have to stand, and then you have to like manually aim, or you have to stand still and manually aim, which I think I started getting used to when I played Resi 4. I haven't actually played it in a while, and I do want to go back to it. But I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either. And a lot of people that played that game have been like, oh no, it's a masterpiece, it's fine, they don't need to change that. And to me, I'm kind of like, well, I think I would maybe prefer it. But I think there's a lot of thought that obviously went into that when you're making that, when the Capcom made that. So, me saying I would like, maybe I would like a bit more of a robust, you can move about and aim at the same time. I can say that, but whether it would actually work for the game, that's another question entirely. But similarly with Jak, thinking back, I don't think a strafe would have worked for Jak, or at least it probably wouldn't have played as well with the kind of gameplay, because the one thing that Jak has is its melee combat is very fluid, and it's mad. When you go back and play Jak 1, I mean, it's 60 frames, and the animation work for Jak and Daxter together is like, it's incredible, honestly, and it's really mind-blowing to look at, because I think there's a lot less thought and care put into some games now. Well, not necessarily thought and care, but obviously, things are done to be more realistic and look better. Whereas Jak, obviously back then, you're looking at kind of more cartoony characters, but they do things like where Daxter will like stretch out, like kind of as you're like moving. If you like do a punch forward, kind of Daxter like holds onto Jak's like shoulder or whatever, but you see Daxter's kind of body like elasticate and stick, like kind of fly back. Same with like when you do the like jump and spin, and there's all these kind of very cool elements. But it's funny because even though that's a more of a cartoony element, it still looks really good, and it didn't look bad. Like, it didn't look, tacky, or it didn't look like it was badly made. It looks very, very well made, in fact. And so, yeah, I think when it comes to the combat, I probably would say probably don't change too much. And I would be interested to know how... But I think the difficulty thing with this, right, is that Jak was the whole combat was, like, centered around this, like, almost, like, 360-degree movement. And what I mean by that is, if you were to play Uncharted, like, Nate, to play, Nate feels pretty heavy, feels almost a bit like a tank. And I wouldn't say I think he's heavier in Uncharted 4, than he is in the other games. But if you were to play Jak 1, 2, or 3, and then to play Uncharted, you would notice this difference. If you pull back on the stick and press square to punch in Jak would he would go back and he would punch back, and and you can shoot and then punch, and you can combine them together. You could do like a I think you could do a punch, and then you could jump, and then you could fire, and he would spin around as you're falling, or something like that. And in Uncharted, well, you would punch, and then the camera would kind of change as you fired, you couldn't, and the jump had nothing to do with combat. So there's a very clear distinction between the two kind of gameplay. Even though I think maybe I wouldn't say to watch, they're clearly different to watch, but when I 360 degree and the more control you have in Jak and Daxter is very different to Uncharted, or to be fair, pretty much any other third-person shooter. So I would hope that they would try and retain that, because I think really the kind of combat you had back there is honestly pretty unique. And I'm sure it's very, if you've played Crash Bandicoot, actually, that's a good example of how to compare it to. Not entirely, but I mean, obviously Naughty Dog made Crash, but they have similar. There's actually a lot of similarities. I think there's even sound effects that were in the old Crash games that were also in Jak, at least Jak 1, which I found really interesting, actually. I was kind of like, when I was replaying it, I think I remember, I don't know what it was, or maybe it was something in Crash 4 that was the same. I don't know, I can't remember, but I'm sure there's something that carries across from the games that you're like, oh, it's Naughty Dog made that, and they made this, that kind of makes sense. And so yeah, that's what I'd hope they would do with the combat, and I guess gameplay as a whole. I don't know how much I'd want them to change, but I think generally the things that they change will likely be to do with the tone and the style of the game that they want to make. And that's where I think I start getting a little bit worried, because if we're going by what they were going to make before Last of Us, I just don't know how well that dark and gritty setting, and it's not, and I say this, it's not like the old, Jak 2 was kind of dark, and you start, spoilers for the beginning, but Jak's kind of getting tortured, and he's in this electric chair kind of thing, and it's, and obviously it plays into the whole story, and it's to do with the dark eco, and he's, it's not as horrific as it probably sounds, but there was still, Jak 2 certainly was more gritty, especially compared to the first game. So it's not like it's oh, don't do anything dark, but I just more mean, don't make it like a super dark world like Last of Us style, where everything is awful and everything, Jak, and I think similarly Uncharted, has this really good balance between, having these serious moments and these characters with genuine feelings and thoughts, but coupling that with a more of a light-hearted narrative. But it doesn't hit the point where it's everything's a joke. This isn't serious at all. I think Metal Gear Solid is kind of like that, but Metal Gear Solid goes to extremes in that regard. Metal Gear Solid isn't just we're having a joke and we're sort of having this serious thing. Metal Gear is kind of very completely random silliness, and then and I don't really think Metal Gear Solid has it's not got the humor of Jak. It's got humorific. That's not, is that the word? Humorous. That's the word I'm looking for. Not hummus. It has humorous elements, but it's not, the same thing. I don't know why I'm talking about Metal Gear Solid, but that's where we are. So yeah, I think that's generally, and I think that pretty much, I don't know if that covers most of what I wanted to say. Just have a look at what other notes that I've written. Yeah, I guess another thing is that I wouldn't want it to be drastically changed. So when we look at God of War, I think if you look at the old God of Wars and the new God of Wars, I wouldn't want Jak to come back and be totally different. I don't think I'd want Jak to come back and be a third-person shooter like Uncharted, because I think a lot of what Jak and Daxter was, there was a lot of unique kind of gameplay, and then it has this, you've got your, like I said, 360 degree controlled movement. You've got the kind of melee attacks, whether it's the spin or the punch and the uppercut and the roll and the long jump. The long jump was kind of connected to the roll. I guess you would roll and then you'd press jump, and you would jump sort of further across the ground. They had hoverboard in Jak 2, and I think Jak 3 had it as well. They had vehicle combat in Jak 3. There was, I think I said, silly sort of side mini games that you could play. Uh, so yeah, I there's a lot of elements that Jak has, and I just don't think they would work very well with trying to make it like Uncharted or Last of Us in that sense. At least when it comes to the gameplay side. Uh, so when we compare that to like God of War, as I said, it's like God of War becomes more of like an RPG, linear. Well, not linear. Sorry, it kind of becomes a bit more open. And you know, I don't know if Jak and Daxter will become linear, but in terms of God of War, I wouldn't want Jak and Daxter changing to that degree. Uh, and I think God of War is actually kind of weird, honestly, when you think about it. And I'm talking about God of War, and I'm making this point because it does relate. But God of War has this thing where it's like a continuing story from the previous games, but it's called God of War, which is the same name as the first God of War. It should have been called God of War 4 because that's what it is. But I think, as it probably would happen with Jak and Daxter, they wouldn't call a new Jak and Daxter Jak 4, or, especially at this point, they would probably just call it Jak and Daxter, or maybe they'll give it a different subtitle. And it's weird when you think about God of War, because I think, God of War does make quite clear, references and callbacks and story elements to key things from the previous games. And I don't know if Jak would do that in the same way, because I mean, a lot of God of War, those elements that it calls back to, are pretty big elements within the game. They're not just these side references that, like, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's a cool little nod to fans. No, there's like a huge part of the game and a huge part of the story literally revolves around Kratos, and he's like, Kratos. I never know how to say Kratos. I think Kratos is probably the best way. Kratos. I don't know. People, they say it in different ways. Yeah, like a large part of the game calls back to those moments, and it's like a huge part of the story. And I don't know if Jak would do the same. I don't think it would be wise for Jak to do the same. I think Jak would have to be in the realm of more like callbacks and references than it would do in like, oh, we're literally continuing the story. But I think it obviously needs to be, done in a way that's separated enough, but maybe has relevance to the old games. And I've actually, in thinking about all this, I'm talking about like them making a new game. I had actually considered, what if they just remade the first game? And I'd be a little bit worried if they did that, because I'm like, oh no, are they going to try and make it look super realistic? I'm like, you had a cartoon world, don't try and make it look realistic. It does not need to look next gen graphics, like super realistic. Like, oh, I can envision that in the real world. Though that said, I would actually be interested to know what that would look like. But if it was the actual game that they're going to spend hours and hours and hours working on, I think I'd want the. I think that's always the difficult thing with games, and there's points where I'm like, oh, how can a dev make something new that is innovative, right? And I'm sure they have this like obviously conversation when thinking about new IPs and things. But it's like that kind of comparison there. It's like, oh, I don't want it to be super realistic, but I'm interested in seeing that. And so like there, you could have two very different looking games, and yet they are still fundamentally the same game. And like, oh, it might be the same place, but two different renders of like, one's super realistic, the other one's more cartoony. But yeah, to my point, hopefully they would go for more of a cartoony vibe. But yeah, anyway, I will link this news story in the description and everything. And I aim to listen to the full like podcast eventually, soonish. So if there's any more thoughts I have, or anything, or any clarifications I want to make, I will probably put something in the comments. But what I found interesting was, I don't think this news story is going to reach as far and wide as the Jason Schreier one from Bloomberg that I spoke about in my other video the other day. But I find it interesting that these two have kind of come out near each other, because I'm like, it's interesting, like this conversation is now happening. We've just had one that's being like, oh, discussing, where people's reaction has been like, oh, Sony, you're only focusing on one type of game, which is something I failed to mention in my other video, I think, was that it's good from a business standpoint, right? It's smart. It's smart what Sony are doing. But yeah, while it's smart from that, it does kind of be like, oh, we then don't get as much variety. So, which again, I said it does make sense, because something I was actually thinking about was that, like, some of the other games, like, I never really properly played Killzone, because I looked at Killzone and didn't think it really appealed to me as much. And I like shooters, but something about it. I played Shadowfall. I think I played Killzone 3, or maybe it was the demo of 3 or the demo of 2. I think I played the demo of 1 actually as well. And I played Kill. There was a PSP game. Oh, and the PS Vita game. There's just been a lot of Killzones actually. Think about that. But yeah, I didn't super love Shadowfall. That's the one I remember most. It was okay. It had a cool weapon. For some reason, the rifle that you had, that was like a assault rifle that could then you could pull the foregrip along and it would become this high powered sniper. That to me is such a cool design for a weapon. I'm love stuff like that. But yeah, I looked at Killzone, never really didn't super appeal to me, and I'm sure I could say the same for other franchises. Whereas when I look at Horizon and when I look at, I guess, even more God of War's become, and when I look at Days Gone and I look at these games, they are, games that I enjoyed genre-wise in when it comes to Uncharted and Last of Us and just generally games in general. So even for me, it's kind of I'm checking. I've probably played more Sony first-party games on PS4 than I did on PS2 or 3, and maybe that was just because I was able to buy more of them. But I also think it was just because they were more down up my street in terms of the kind of games that I enjoy. And so it's a weird one, right? I'm kind of I want these kind of more varied games, but even for me, and when it comes to the business, even for me, it's I check them out more. But I do think I get kind of burnt out on them in the way, I think you compare Horizon and Ghost of Tsushima, and they're very different games. They're not really similar, but they also have similar elements, and so you sort of end up doing the same things just in different ways. In terms of in Ghost, you're upgrading your Jin, and you're upgrading you're picking up the mods and things you can equip on him and upgrading his abilities, and in Horizon you're getting higher powered weapons and different abilities, but you're doing it all through a skill tree, and there's a lot of these elements that kind of blend together. This is kind of, again, these are very podcasty rambles. This is probably just going to how that be, but this is heading towards 40 minutes, which is much longer than this is well, not heading as twice as long as the other episode, but it's a fair nearly 10 minutes more. But yeah, so as I said, I don't think a Jak and Daxter game will probably happen at least anytime soon, maybe ever. I think probably it won't happen ever. It's cool. I'm glad that we have the ports on PS4 and obviously now PS5. That's something I'm glad about, because it now means that I don't have to leave those games behind. They are on this current generation, and they were last gen. It's that's been a pretty big, But I think backwards compatibility has still been one of my favorite elements of PS5, and it's a shame it's not more widespread, because I don't think in the mainstream people really care too much about backwards compatibility. Well, I say that I don't think they do, but it's one of these weird things, right? And this is a completely different topic, but you would think that backwards compatibility would be good, and you would think that people would like it, because if you're a family and you've got a PS4 and you're looking to upgrade, but you've just bought a couple of games for your PS4, and you spend a lot of money, you probably don't want to just be and time to move on to the next console, and we move on. And maybe people do, but it's weird. I don't understand why backwards compatibility isn't a more praised thing, really. And I think it is. You see it online, but you hear also from the mainstream that people don't care about that kind of thing, and it baffles me, honestly. I think it's such a great feature. I genuinely do not understand why backwards compatibility wouldn't be a thing, unless obviously it's not a thing if it's hardware restricted or whatever. But just in general, I don't understand why people don't celebrate that and ask for that more often. As I said, completely different topic. Maybe it's something I'll talk about later. But yeah, I do think that with these news stories, this news story and the other one, it's interesting, and I think it's interesting to get this conversation kind of going. And I don't really think it will do anything currently, but it seems like there's obviously a demand. There's obviously a call out, at least online on Twitter, and on Twitter I think is quite a different place to the real world at times, and I think the opinions that I see on there, whether I agree or disagree with them, tend to not always be the one that's kind of driving the mainstream, and it's not driving Sony's choices when it comes to them as a company. What will probably drive their choice is data and the profits that they make, and so they probably make a lot of money from these games, and so that's probably why they would continue them. And so for that kind of reason, I don't think we'll see a Jak game anytime soon. But it is interesting to me that this conversation happened, and it does make me wonder, what are Naughty Dog going to do next, and are they going to do something that's kind of tonally and thematically similar to Last of Us or Uncharted, or are they going to go in a different direction and they're going to aim for something like, more cartoony and more kind of out there, like Jak and Daxter or Ratchet and Clank or something in it, and that's why I am genuinely interested to see where things will go from now. Naughty Dog obviously have just finished Last of Us Part 2, and I think, as I said before, Naughty Dog are the kind of developer that I think will drive this direction. They are the developer that I think, if there is going to be any turning point in terms of the kind of games that Sony publish, it will be because of Naughty Dog. Because I just think, and I think their name at this point will now also sell games. It will sell them like really well. After Last of Us Part 2, I'm sure there's some angry people, out there that you probably won't want to buy a Naughty Dog game because they did. Oh, spoilers for Last of Us Part 2, by the way. If you've not played it, if you haven't heard about it or not been spoiled about it, but, Joel gets killed. Everyone hated that about it, But I guess people, probably there'll be people out there that just don't want to buy Naughty Dog games now. They're going to boycott Naughty Dog because they did something they didn't like in a video game. I shouldn't say things like this. It's controversial. People will see it and get angry. But yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up the main things I wanted to say. I'm looking at my notes. I don't think that I really said anything else. I get the only other thing was that I mentioned about Jak remake, and I don't think a Jak remake would happen anytime soon. If it was going to happen, and I think I'd be a little bit worried about a remake happening, because I think the games are actually it's actually really interesting playing old games, because you can clearly tell they don't have the same visual fidelity. That's a word. They don't have that same visual quality and fidelity that you see now, but they still don't look that bad, kind of thing. And for the time, but also going back, I think they don't look bad. And when it comes to Jak 1, I think all Jak games actually run at 60 frames. And Jak 1 and 2 and 3 have these really great animations, and actually some of that animation carries across into Jak X. I remember you're racing around the track, and similarly to if you dashed or you punched or whatever in Jak 1, 2, or 3, and Daxter stretches, same thing happens in Jak X when you go around a corner or stuff like that. There's some really cool attention to detail stuff that I think makes the game you're playing feel like it looks better almost. It doesn't feel like it looks better, but I think those games hold up pretty well from memory, and at least in Jak 1, I recently played it. I might potentially, I actually don't know if I'm going to do this. I was going to do some images for this, but I thought about just recording some Jak 1 gameplay that I thought I would just play while I'm talking. So there might be some Jak 1 gameplay up, and so if I've been talking all this time, you've kind of been seeing on screen the kind of game that it is if you're unfamiliar. And I'd really recommend trying out the games, honestly. If you like Crash Bandicoot, whether it's the old games or if it's Crash 4, I'd really check out at least Jak 1, because that's the closest to that. And if you want something a little bit more sprawling and open world, you got Jak 2 and 3. But I haven't replayed those recently, so I like them more for nostalgia at the moment. But yeah. And if you really want to find out more about Jak and Daxter, I mentioned TheGamingBritShow earlier. I'll probably leave a link in the description to a video of his, but he did I think it was an hour, it was more than an hour, I think it was 70 or 80 minutes of his thoughts on Jak 1, 2, and 3, and he has a separate video on Jak X. If you want to see more of Jak and Daxter and just see his thoughts, and a lot of his thoughts align with mine, and it's a really interesting video. He points out a bunch that I don't remember, or that I didn't notice when I was younger, so yeah, it's certainly worth checking out, and I'll probably leave a link in the description. And yeah, I guess this is the end for this video, or this podcast. If you missed it, the other day I posted my top games of 2020. As I said, it's April, that's the perfect time for that kind of thing. So you can go and check that out. That's in both written and audio form, so you can listen to that, or you can read it, whichever. And a few days before that, I also posted the video, much like this one, so if you enjoyed this ramble talk, you can go and check that out, talking about the news about The Last of Us remake, and what I call the PlayStation portfolio, which is I've touched on it a few times in this video, about how Sony are as a company, and their general output in the past few years. But yeah, if that's something you enjoy, you should go and if this is something you should enjoy, you should go and check those out. If you want to, I guess subscribe if you want to see or hear more of this kind of thing. You can check out my website if you want to read years worth of various things. There's lots of things I'm trying to work on at the moment. At least plan to. Kind of the YouTube thing's still kind of early days, testing things out. There's a bunch that I've uploaded in the past, but this is kind of a new format for me, so feedback on this or anything would be greatly appreciated. This is certainly more of a podcast episode at this point, and I've thought about uploading these to Spotify and places as well. So yeah, if you wanna check any of this out, you can go there and go and check out things on Spotify. But yeah, well, if I post on Spotify, I should say. I haven't yet, but I might, and I'll give a heads up if I do, and I'll probably upload the back catalogue of previous episodes and videos and audio things to be there as well. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So, ciao.